All right, let's dive into the pretty wild, and yeah, sometimes grisly, world of forensic entomology. This is a field where, believe it or not, the tiniest creatures at a crime scene can tell the biggest stories, uncovering clues that you would totally miss otherwise.
And you might think this is some kind of modern, high-tech science. But get this, the idea of using insects to solve crimes goes back centuries. The very first written record we have is from 13th century China. A farmer was found murdered, killed with a sickle, and to find the killer, the local magistrate had a pretty genius idea.
He made all the farmers in the village lay their sickles down on the ground, and after a little while, only one of them started attracting flies. Blowflies, to be exact. They were drawn to the microscopic traces of blood that were totally invisible to everyone else. Faced with that, the owner of that sickle had nowhere to go. He confessed on the spot.
So how exactly do they do it? Well, here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the basics, then look at the two main clocks that forensic entomologists use to tell time. We'll also get into all the tricky factors that can mess up their calculations. And finally, we'll see what else these tiny witnesses can tell us besides just the time of death.
Okay, first up, what exactly are we talking about when we say forensic entomology? Let's break down the fundamentals.
Basically, it's the science of using what we know about bugs for legal stuff. You know, for a long time, some people kind of dismissed it as voodoo science, but today it's a seriously powerful tool for investigators. It gives a voice to victims who can't speak for themselves anymore.
Okay, here's a super important point you have to understand. Insects don't just show up the second someone dies. There's almost always a lag. That's why the age of the oldest bugs on a body gives us the minimum post-mortem interval. It's the absolute latest that death could have happened. To be even more accurate, experts now often use the term colonization interval, which is just the time since insects actually showed up and made the body their home.
So the first method in the toolkit is what you can think of as the development clock. It works by tracking the super predictable life cycle of the very first insects that arrive on the scene, and it's most useful in the first few weeks after death.
And these are the guys we're talking about. These are the first responders. Flies like these can be drawn to a body in just minutes, sometimes hours, because they can smell the chemical signals of decomposition from far away. They're nature's own CSI team.
And this life cycle runs like a very precise clock. So flies lay their eggs in protected spots, which then hatch into larvae, maggots. These maggots eat and grow, and they molt through 3 different stages called instars. Once they're full, they crawl away to a drier spot to pupate, inside a hard little case. When the adult fly pops out, it leaves that empty case behind, which itself is a huge piece of evidence.
So, how long does this whole process take? Well, under normal summer conditions, the entire journey from egg to adult fly takes about 10 to 14 days. By figuring out the oldest stage of insect found on a body, an entomologist can basically count backwards to figure out the minimum time that's passed.
But what happens after a few weeks? When that first wave of flies has already done its thing and moved on? Well, for that, we have to turn to a totally different kind of clock. This one isn't about one species' life cycle, but about the predictable arrival of different waves of insects over time.
And this is a great illustration of something called faunal succession. See, as a body changes, it attracts a whole parade of different insects, one after the other. First, you get the flies. Then, as the body gets drier, certain beetles and moths show up. And finally, months or even years later, you get other kinds of beetles and mites that come in for the very last bits. The specific group of insects you find acts like a calendar, telling a story that can span years.
Now, using these clocks sounds pretty straightforward, right? Find the bug, check the clock. But it's not that simple. An entomologist's calculation is actually really complex, and they have to account for a ton of different things that can speed that clock up or slow it way, way down.
And the single biggest factor, the number one thing they have to consider is temperature. Insects are cold-blooded. That means their growth is almost completely controlled by how warm or cold it is. Hot weather speeds them up, and cold weather can slow them down or even hit pause on their development.
So to get around this temperature problem, scientists use something called accumulated degree hours. It sounds complicated, but think of it like a receipt for heat. An insect needs to collect a certain amount of heat energy to move from one life stage to the next. By calculating this, experts can figure out how old an insect is in heat units instead of just calendar days, which is way more accurate.
And then things get even more complicated when you throw drugs and poisons into the mix. See, maggots are eating the body's tissues, so they also eat any substances that are in those tissues. Some drugs, like cocaine, can actually make maggots grow faster, but others, like arsenic, can slow them down, which would totally throw off the timeline if you didn't know about it.
And here's a really wild one. The maggots can change their own temperature. Yeah, a big group of them, what's called a maggot mass, can generate a ton of metabolic heat. We're talking enough to raise the temperature way above the air around them, creating this little microclimate that actually makes them and their buddies develop even faster.
So because of all these variables, collecting the evidence has to be done perfectly. For this stuff to hold up in court, you have to follow a very strict procedure. You take samples from different spots. Half of them are killed right away in boiling water, which sounds weird, but it stops them from shrinking so you get an accurate size for aging them. The other half you keep alive and raise them into adult flies, because it's way easier to know the exact species you're dealing with from the adult. And of course, you have to record the temperature of everything, the air and that maggot mass.
And you have to remember, the evidence isn't always right there on the body. Once maggots are done eating, they wander off. That means you can find crucial clues, like these empty pupil cases, in the dirt nearby, under a rug, or even hidden in the seams of the victim's clothing.
But figuring out a timeline is really just scratching the surface. Insects can also tell us so much more about the crime itself, helping investigators piece together the whole story.
And this is why it all matters so much. Think about it. If maggots are on the hands instead of the face, that could point to defensive wounds. If you find insects that only live in the countryside on a body found in the city, that's pretty clear proof the body was moved. In horrible cases of neglect, the life cycle of maggots on a living person can actually establish how long the abuse has been going on. And sometimes, when a body is too decomposed to test for drugs, the maggots themselves can be tested to help figure out the cause of death.
And this isn't just a textbook theory. What you're seeing here is actual evidence from a famous case, the Ruxton murders back in 1935. The killer tried to say his victims had just left town weeks before they were found, but the maggots on the bodies were only about 12 days old. That proved the murders happened much more recently, right when he was the only suspect. That insect evidence completely destroyed his alibi and helped convict him.
Forensic entomology really shows us that even in our darkest moments, nature has a story to tell. A fly on the wall isn't just a saying. It can be the most important witness there is. It really makes you wonder, if we can learn this much from insects, what other secrets are just waiting to be discovered all around?